Around 2800 BC, there lived a hunter named Nimrod in Babylon, which was located between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Whenever wild animals threatened the people, he protected them with his power. As people respected and supported him, Nimrod became arrogant and incited people to build the Tower of Babel.
Let us build a tower that reaches to the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth.
Such deeds of Nimrod that were against God has continued even after Nimrod had died. Semiramis, Nimrod's wife, insisted that Nimrod became the sun god. She cut Nimrod's dead body into pieces and sent them to each tribe of Babylon. People regarded the place where a part of Nimrod was buried as sacred. She also claimed that Nimrod was reincarnated as her son.
The sun god Nimrod was reincarnated as my son Tammuz. He who believes and follows Tammuz follows Nimrod.
As Semiramis ruled over Babylon in place of her young son Tammuz, she maneuvered people into worshiping her. Monuments of Semiramis carrying her child Tammuz in her arms were set up all over Babylon, along with various images symbolizing the sun god. The sun worship and the mother-child worship, which was a scheme devised by Semiramis, put down roots as a religion of Babylon. Idolatry stemmed from Babylon, spread to many countries after the Tower of Babel collapsed. It is because when the Babylonians were scattered over the whole world, they brought the sun worship and the mother-child worship. The sun worship and the mother-child worship were assimilated into the cultures and religions of many countries, and they came to have various forms and names. Nimrod, the sun god, was known as Mithra in Persia, Sol in Rome, Ra or Horus in Egypt, and Apollo in Greece. Semiramis and Tammuz, who were the start of the mother-child worship, was called Isis and Horus, Venus and Dionysus, Diana and Attis, and Astaroth and Tammuz, respectively. Besides these, the image of goddess, who is holding a baby in her arms, was venerated in many countries of the world. If so, was the mother-child worship the creature of an age, which was especially welcomed only in Babylon? Surprisingly, the mother-child worship of Babylon has been passed down through the thousands of years and still exists today. In Vatican of Rome, we can find the mother-child worship in its original state.
Now, further down in the story, as Tammuz grows and becomes a man, Tammuz actually marries his mother, and they have a very sexual relationship. And that baby Tammuz and his mother Semiramis is where you get the story of Cupid. Cupid, during Valentine's Day, is how the story of Valentine's Day developed, was from Tammuz, who married a very unbiblical relationship with his mother. Okay, back to the story of Tammuz. So Tammuz, for 40 years, was a tremendous hunter, and he took the place of his father, ruling the world, and had tremendous power. But more than anything, he was a credible hunter. But unfortunately, his gift and his skill of hunting caught up with him one day, because he was killed during his 40th year by a wild boar. And so what happens is you're going to see similarities now between the holiday of Easter and the traditions that we celebrate during Easter, and all of these traditions that date back 2, 3, and 4,000 years ago. So right off the bat, we discover that the Easter Bunny comes from that one act that Semiramis did when she broke out of the egg. Let's see if we can find some other traditions as we move along here. Now, every spring, the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, they have what was called Ishtar's Sunday. And they would have a sunrise service. Now, this part of the legend is difficult to confirm because there's so many different versions. You can make up your own mind whether or not this particular part of the legend will be credited to you. But it is quite interesting how one particular part of the legend lines up so eerily with dying of Easter eggs. Because what they used to do in this part of the legend was that at the sunrise service, the priest of Ishtar would impregnate young virgins on the altar, and during that same service, they would take the babies that were now 3-month-old from the previous year, and they would sacrifice those children on the altar to Ishtar, and then they would take the eggs of Ishtar, and they would dip those eggs in the blood of those young infants. And that is where we get sunrise services, and that is potentially where we get the dying of Easter eggs. It is also interesting to note that worldwide universal color of Easter eggs is red. Even the White House, the official color of the White House Easter egg is ruby red. Now, back to Tammuz. Tammuz gets killed by a wild boar. So every year in commemoration of celebrating the death and the deification of Tammuz, which became the son of God, the son of his father, they would set aside 40 days prior to Easter, and they would fast and they would pray, and they would have a giant feast on Easter Sunday where they would celebrate the death and the resurrection of Tammuz. And guess what they would have for dinner on that Sunday evening? You got it, Easter ham. They would kill a boar in commemoration to Tammuz, who was killed by a wild boar. And yes, the 40 days prior to Easter, where we call it Lent, or the Catholics call it Lent, that 40 days did not come from, my friends, the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. That 40 days was already in place for thousands of years before Jesus even showed up. It comes from the 40 days of fasting and praying for Tammuz before they celebrated Easter. The 40 days of the fasting and praying of Jesus, and I like to call him by his Hebrew name, Yeshua, which means salvation. Yeshua's fasting and praying in the wilderness for 40 days is just a coincidence. Why? Because the Father knows the truth, and the enemy used to be the right-hand man of the Father. And he knows the prophecies. He knew exactly how everything was going to be laid out. So he developed all of these traditions of men and all of these legends, whether they be true or not true, but he developed them to skew our foresight and our ability to understand that when the truth would actually come, that we would not recognize it. He created a fraud, and we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And so we begin to see some of these traditions. We discovered where Lent came from. We've discovered where Easter ham came from. We've discovered where the sunrise service came from. We've even discovered why we chose the first Sunday after the spring equinox. We didn't choose it. It's always been there on the celebration of Easter. Now,
so let's take a look at the origins of the Easter traditions and symbolisms we've all learned to love and celebrate. When we take a look at the most prominent symbols of our spring and Easter, the rabbit and the egg, we have to ask, where did these come from? When you research the origins of both the rabbit and the egg, you'll be led to the story of the Babylonian goddess Semiramis. Legend has it that after Semiramis died, she ascended into heaven and was returned to earth inside of a large egg which fell into the Euphrates River. The egg was pushed ashore by a dove, and she emerged from the egg as Astarte, or Ishtar, or Easter in English. She's also known as the moon goddess as in the lady on the moon, maybe you've seen on Miller High Life products. In fact, this is where the name Monday or Moon Day originates from, the day you worship the moon goddess Semiramis. Semiramis, to show her gratitude to the dove, turned it into an egg-laying rabbit. And when we take a look at these are all signs of fertility.
It is more correctly called Resurrection Sunday. Easter is a pagan term, and it is the English pronunciation of the ancient goddess of fertility and sex. Many pagan springtime festivals featuring this goddess were conducted in the ancient world at just about the same time the Jewish celebration of Passover, and then, of course, eventually the Christian celebration of the resurrection. This is why this particular pagan celebration is associated with bunnies and eggs and springtime flowers, all of which are rich symbols of fertility and sex. These symbols have nothing to do with the celebration of Resurrection Day. This pagan goddess came out of the Assyrian and Babylonian cultures as well as the ancient Northwest Semitic cultures. She was interchangeably called by these names. The late English pronunciation of these names is Easter. Did you know that the pagan springtime Easter celebrations were incorporated into the Roman Catholic traditions in order to appease the Roman government and the paganized citizens of the Roman Empire? This was a source of extreme controversy among many Christians and church leaders. Many bodies of worship inside and outside the early Catholic hierarchy refused to incorporate the pagan celebrations. This controversy started as early as the early 300s AD. Sadly and shamefully, this is why today many Christian churches still refer to Resurrection Sunday as Easter. In the New Testament, in the original Greek manuscripts, the word Passover is used 29 times. The King James Version translators got it correct 28 times. Sadly, they got it incorrect in Acts chapter 12 when they translated the Greek word for Passover as Easter. That's right, the King James Version actually uses the pagan word Easter when the original language clearly says Passover. Many believe that this incorrect translation was largely because of the Catholic and the early British cultural influence over the King James Version translation. Others believe that it was done purposely to indicate that Herod's attempt to execute Peter aligned not only with the Jewish Passover but with the Roman pagan festivals of Easter. If that is so, then inserting the word Easter would have been an editorial and interpretive insertion, because the original Greek word is Passover. The time of Resurrection Sunday always corresponds with the Jewish Passover. It is always the first Sunday after the establishment of the Jewish Passover feast day. This is because Jesus was celebrating the ancient Passover meal with his disciples, when just shortly after the meal he would be arrested and crucified. Jesus was not crucified on a Friday. This is another Catholic misinterpretation of Scriptures. Passover of that week was Thursday night at 6 p.m. The entire day of Thursday was called Preparation Day. Jesus took the Passover on Wednesday of that week. To eat the meal 24 hours early was allowed by the ancient Jewish customs. And Jesus was crucified on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. He was dead by 3 p.m. The Passover feast started at 6 p.m. Jesus became our Passover lamb and fulfilled the feast of Passover on Thursday afternoon. By Friday, he had been in the tomb 1 night and 1 day. The promise was on its way to being fulfilled. For this reason, it can still be called Good Friday. With his crucifixion on Thursday afternoon, by the time Sunday morning came, this would have Jesus in the tomb 3 full nights and rising on the 3rd full day, in direct fulfillment of Jesus' promise and scriptural prophecies.